Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for How Progressives Can Shape the Democrats' 2021 Climate Agenda on this 200th day of March into 2020. It's good for you all to be here. Thank you for joining. I know that it's weird probably being at a virtual conference. I had to do one of these earlier, not the ideal circumstances, obviously, but we really appreciate you all joining us for what should hopefully be an exciting discussion. So we're convening today's conversation amidst three overlapping crises. More than 167,000 people have died from the coronavirus in the United States, and that's including actually more than 1,100 people just yesterday. Globally, there have been more than 760,000 deaths. 16.3 million Americans were unemployed as of July, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, up 10.6 million since the coronavirus hit in February. Meanwhile, atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide peaked 410 parts per million yesterday. The last time that happened, forests grew on Antarctica, the Greenland ice sheet did not yet exist, and sea levels were more than 50 feet higher than they are today. Our species, people we would identify as Homo sapiens, did not yet walk the earth. In March, all of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere led to a significant finding from NOAA, which found that global land and ocean surface temperatures were 1.16 degrees Celsius or 2.09 degrees Fahrenheit for all us Americans above the 20th century average. But there are reasons perhaps maybe not to despair just yet. On the political scene, there are some hopeful signs. Last month, former Vice President Joe Biden announced new clean energy and environmental justice plans, committing to invest $2 trillion over the next 4 years into a clean energy economy, 40% of which would go to communities on the front lines of climate change, pollution, and poverty. The plans would also set the United States on track to source 100% of its electricity from clean and emissions-free sources by 2035. So, with an election coming up in November and progressives growing in power, what is to be done and what can we, specifically as progressives, do? To discuss this, we have a pretty all-star panel, if I don't say so myself. We have Rihanna Gunn-Wright, Director of Climate Policy for the Roosevelt Institute and one of the architects of the Green New Deal. We have Anthony Rogers-Wright, Policy Coordinator and Green New Deal Policy Lead for the Climate Justice Alliance. We have Sam Ricketts, the co-founder of Evergreen Action and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. And we have Lauren Maunis, legislative manager for the Sunrise Movement and arguably the most influential 22-year-old on Capitol Hill. I always have to get that one in there. I'm so sorry. Okay, and not to put Lauren on the spot, but we're actually going to start with Lauren. Lauren, from your perspective, as one of the sort of folks who's most dedicated to this work with the Sunrise Movement, can you give us sort of your lay of the landscape and how you see things moving in the movement and politics more broadly?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for that intro, Julian. Really great to be here. And yeah, humbled and honored to share this panel with friends and comrades in the space. So yeah, I think Sunrise was founded on the premise that we know that in order to stop the climate crisis, we need to put justice at the center of any movement and any climate policy. And the climate crisis is actually the only opportunity big enough to create millions of good jobs for this country and actually lift this country out of cyclical millions of people out of cyclical poverty and tackle systemic racial and economic injustice. And so, we launched in, a few years ago with the motto to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. And we were working to create climate as top of the Democratic agenda and create a movement of millions of young people to bring the urgency of the climate crisis to the doorsteps of politicians across the country and to really organize our communities behind this. And I think we're in this moment now of kind of seeing a lot of forces align in our favor and not as a coincidence, as a direct result of our organizing from the past few years. And I think we're at a moment now where, of course, the pandemic has really illuminated the need for transformative action on all sectors of the economy, and really the premise that in order to lift this country out of economic depression, that we have the solution, which is the Green New Deal, which is tackling the climate crisis at the scale that both justice and science demand. And we have a really strong coalition of movement partners and organizations and labor partners kind of all coalescing behind this vision for transformative change. And we have a political opportunity and political window that our movement has been kind of arcing towards for a few years now. So we're feeling hopeful, but we also know that no matter who the next president is, that it's our role to turn millions of people out into the streets and deliver a really clear mandate for the most aggressive, ambitious climate and economic policy that our country has seen. And that is kind of what we are laser focused on for going into the election and after the election. That looking to history, like this level of sweeping transformation that we're calling for has only happened when millions of people are on the streets disrupting business as usual and demanding that our elected officials cannot ignore us. So we're feeling hopeful and energized, and also really committed to delivering the clearest mandate, since this opportunity looks like it's presenting ourselves in our favor.
Sam, I wanted to turn to you next, because that mandate is taking an increasingly sort of definitive policy shape. There was actually a really interesting pair of articles written by David Roberts at Vox about a month or two ago about that emergent policy consensus. And I understand that Evergreen and the Inslee campaign played a pretty significant role in shaping that.
Well, thanks, Julian. It's great to be here with my distinguished panelists, fellow panelists, and to be talking with everyone here with Netroots. I think it's important to take stock of the progress that the movement has made, that progressives have made in shaping the direction and the moment we are finding ourselves in, or inching towards, at least. And I'll do that in point of course in answering the question more directly, Julian. I think I remember I was at Netroots in New Orleans in the summer of 2018, 2 years ago. Lauren, was the first time I met Varshni, executive director of Sunrise, and just a few months prior, Rob Meyer at The Atlantic had published a piece about how Democrats really didn't have a plan to confront the climate crisis that sticks a lot of people's minds. And the 2018 elections hadn't yet happened, so we hadn't had a wave of against Trump yet really take electoral form. We hadn't had new governors and state legislators, or not, at least not as many as we've had now, take office. And we hadn't had the Green New Deal introduced yet, which changed the entire equation. It really was, I mean, a catalyst that has led so much to this. So, that summer 2018, you lead into the fall, you do have a bunch of new folks take office, particularly at the state and local level, where progress has been ongoing. In November in 2018, you have the Green New Deal. First of all, you have the Sunrise sit-in Speaker Pelosi's office, and you have the Green New Deal, thanks to Rihanna and so many others, launched in February of 2019. And then you kick off basically a presidential primary process where you had a bit of a race to the top and out climating each other in a way that has never happened before for the people that are trying to carry the standard for the Democratic Party. Last year I worked for one of those candidates, Governor Jay Inslee's presidential campaign. And I think a lot of different threads have tied themselves together, and this has been driven by the movement, and elected officials and candidates for office have been responsive to it. But I think the definition or the agenda as it's congealing itself is coming into better focus in a way that it really hadn't. I think those fighting for climate action, first of all, have known for a decade they were going to be locked out of power in Washington, D.C. And now that opportunity, as Lauren mentioned, may be knocking on our door for 2021, I think that there's a few different strands that I tie together in my mind around being an investment-led agenda. The idea of that actually this is about an agenda of not just stopping pollution, but investing in our communities, investing in workers, investing in frontline communities, putting money into people's pockets and into infrastructure so that we're actually building a better future and better economy and society for ourselves. Investments. This is about standards. This is about not reducing pollution through macroeconomic price signals, just like a carbon price. It's actually about holding individual companies and industries accountable, making them achieve greater clean electricity, making them build cleaner cars. This is about justice. This is about a long overdue recognition of the disparate environmental impacts, environmental racism that is facing some communities and more than others. That pollution is intentionally impacting some communities far more than others. Communities of color, communities of poverty, indigenous communities. Those are a result of intentional policy choices that must be confronted and redressed. And then the confrontation of fossil fuel industries, like a meaningful accountability to the fact that we've had industries poisoning our communities, poisoning our air, polluting our planet, and that those need to be confronted. And I think there are strings through each of these that drive. I draw a straight line, the investments. I draw a straight line to the ambition that the Green New Deal brought into the investments and into each part of this agenda. The standards that need to be part of driving a clean energy economy have really been taking root at the state level for a number of years, but especially of late, you've had states and local communities driving standards into law. In justice, as I mentioned, a long overdue reckoning, still too slow in the need to center communities of color and the need to center frontline communities in these solutions. And in fossil fuel accountability and confrontation. I mean, you've got the movement that you keep in the ground. You've got the very successful organizing movements against pipelines, against polluting power plants around the country. I think that those have formed the recipe from which we'll be making a master stew, I hope, next year.
I have on some calls and Slack messages with Sam playfully referred to standards, investment, justice as the holy trinity of climate policy. So excuse me for my flippancy. But anyways, that last letter, J, justice, has often, far too often, I would say, been sidelined in the conversation around climate policy, and I would actually just argue climate policy writ large. And so I wanted to turn to you, Anthony, to discuss, what it looks like to take the J, justice, seriously.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, brother Noise Cat. And it's obviously such an honor to be here. And I can also attest to the fact that Sister Lauren is a bionic 22-year-old for sure. She is a beacon of how this is definitely an intergenerational fight. So it's always good to share space with her. In this discussion of justice, we're seeing it a lot more centered now. And what we're trying to really demonstrate is that it's not just perfunctory and it's not just lip service. Environmental justice communities, the environmental justice and climate justice movement, whose shoulders that we quite frankly stand on, have been centering this since the 1996 Jiménez Principles for Democratic Organizing, and we can start right there. We all know the Jiménez Principles, which include principles like be inclusive, let people speak for themselves, and these are so germane, and so what we really need to do is not just put them up on walls when we meet with each other, but really do the training so that it diffuses into us, so that the way that we organize, the way that we write policy, the way that we implement policy, it's axiomatic as it pertains to including a justice lens. We're obviously very proud. I've worked with all of you on various bills, including the bill that Representative Ocasio-Cortez and of course Senator Harris just released in the Climate Equity Act, and where we're going to be scoring things from the lens of climate justice. So that's just really, really important, because as Brother Sam said, at the end of the day, if we're not getting justice out of this, right, it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, we're not going to solve the climate crisis without addressing social injustices, including racial injustice, gender injustice, immigrant injustice, injustice for those who are incarcerated. All of that fits into that holy trinity that you were just talking about. At the Climate Justice Alliance, right around the time that I started working with Lauren and the rest of you, and Sister Rihanna, of course, with the Green New Deal Network coordinating team, we created what we called the People's Solutions Lens for a Green New Deal. And, to really answer the question that you just asked me, Julian, and it really is just, 5 questions. Who's telling the story, who's making the decisions, who's benefiting and how, what else is being impacted, and how will this build or shift power? Because when we're talking about justice, we definitely also have to talk about this idea of building and shifting power. And then, the final things that I'll say on this is that, like, the great news is that we have examples of this in place, right? Everybody knows about the landmark legislation that came out of New York State through the leadership of the New York Renews Network, including CJA members, UPROSE, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and Push Buffalo. And that was, everything that you just asked me manifest, centering justice, but also centering the people who have been the most impacted by injustice, and making sure that, they weren't just asked to do something after the fact, but they were a part of the entire process. The result, of course, is a landmark bill that is considered by some to be the most aggressive piece of climate policy in the country, if not the world. We've seen this also in Portland with the tax that they're putting on to big businesses to redivert that. I mean, that was justice centered. And then, of course, the amazing work that I've gotten to do with Rihanna and Lauren recently on something that we call Transform, Heal, and Renew through investing in vibrant economies, or the Thrive Agenda. Lauren and Rihanna and myself, and to some extent you and Sam as well, Julian, we have been really hyper vigilant about making sure that justice is centered. It was one of the reasons why I was really honored to work with Sam when he was working on the Inslee campaign, because my governor, he took that very, very seriously. And, you saw this kind of start to cascade with, no pun intended, with other candidates, including obviously Brother Bernie, Senator Warren, and even Senator Harris. So I think that the overarching paradigm is that if justice isn't at the center for all of our climate policy work, it's not so much that it's inadequate as much as that it's illegitimate.
So one reflection I have about this sort of broad strokes area of work from where I sit, which is at Data for Progress, which is a sort of upstart left-leaning think tank, is that we often talk about different constituencies that need to be organized and mobilized in favor of something along the lines of a Green New Deal or big sweeping climate legislation. We talk about labor unions, we talk about frontline communities, we talk about environmentalists, but a class that doesn't often get talked about in needing to be sort of mobilized and organized in its own way are wonks themselves, are policy experts, the folks who are contacted by politicians and their staff to shape legislation and policy. And Rihanna, I know that you oversee a pretty significant policy portfolio at the Roosevelt Institute. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how the wonk class itself needs to be organized and transformed.
Yeah, excuse me, totally. So I'll start with the fact that a lot of policy making is far more complex, not in the sense of like, it's hard like a calculus class, but complex is, and there are far more people involved than most people think. There's often, most of us don't really think about how our laws are made past like Schoolhouse Rock. And there's sort of a one we often think of essentially there are activists and there are politicians, and there is sort of a one-to-one relationship. But the fact is that there's a whole industry that exists just to work on policy. Think tanks, to some extent, well, lobbyists don't really count in this, but there's think tanks, there's academic centers, there are, you know, businesses, say like Goldman Sachs or whatnot, that are treated as centers of intellectual thought. And what this means is that a lot of what is taken seriously or not taken seriously when it comes to policy is decided in large part by this sort of gray apparatus, these think tanks, these academics. And that's not to say that they're a final word, but a lot of times they are, like you said, Julian, they're the ones called on to shape policy. They're the ones that are getting calls about, will this break the economy or not, right? They're the ones who are weighing in and telling people this is reasonable and this is not. And so organizing them is really important, because if something doesn't fit into sort of the mainstream ideology, often it can get sort of kicked out. And so moving this group on things like the importance of investment on climate, like that's, I think, a very clear example of where a lot of folks, including myself, have like tried to organize wonks around the Green New Deal, around this idea that you can invest a bunch of money in climate, that climate is very important to an economic recovery, right? Those are things that even 2 years ago, we were still talking about carbon taxes, right, as the main thing that, or even that we're fighting about. And that's changed, yes, because of activists, but also because there are a number of people who have been working in those spaces to whisper to people about the value of the public sector in the economy, the value of investments, et cetera. So it's really important, because if those folks don't take ideas seriously, it's much easier for a framework, say like the Green New Deal, to be accepted, but what comes out on the other side looks nothing like the framework, because the people that wrote it don't have the necessary knowledge, right? The sort of new ideologies, the new ways of thinking about the economy that you need them to have. So organizing wonks is just like, it's really, really crucial to actually getting policy, particularly systemic policy, with all of the agencies and whatnot that have to be involved and that you have to think about. It's very important to make sure that sort of what comes out at the end looks like the vision that you had initially.
So a famous theorist of wonking class politics once said, "First as tragedy, second as farce." And this, as I'm sure folks might be aware, is not the first time that Democrats, if they win some elections in November, will take a shot on, hopefully take a shot on some sort of comprehensive climate legislation. There was, of course, before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Markey, there was Waxman Markey. That was the original mixtape. And so I'm wondering if, I know that a lot of the folks here were maybe not involved in politics at the time. I was in high school, I'll just say, when Waxman Markey was being meted out. But some of us also have some experience from those days, and some of us have certainly read about and studied what happened with the big cap and trade bill fight. And so I'm wondering if, I guess I'll pose this to Sam first, since he's the elder hand, I guess, of the group. You know, what are sort of the lessons that need to be learned from the first time around in this fight that we need to get right if we get a second shot come 2021?
Thanks, Julian. Happy to take that one and then visit some unhappy memories. I was involved as a congressional staffer, a bit role in that effort a decade more ago. You know, I think I would say two different things. I think the first is the lesson to be learned, which is operational. And the second is the lessons that I think have been learned, which kind of gets into the first point that I was saying about we're in a different world. Someone said to me the other day, we're going to have something like that happen again. I think they were referring more to the policy than the failure of the policy. And I was saying, no, that's not true. We live in a different world now. So anyways, the first point is, I think there's a lesson in ensuring that this kind of gets to what Brianna was saying too, that the people developing the policy and advocating for it don't get so far from what the movement is talking about and wanting that it becomes something without the popular support that's required to get passed. It results in worse policy. It also results in policy that doesn't get implemented. And I think that is an evidence from the way some of that bill was constructed. Now, I think there's a lot of merit in things that were advanced in that time frame, and also the recovery investments in a green economy. The $90 billion spent as part of the Recovery Act was transformational for the opportunity that we now have for us to build the clean energy economy. And I would defend many of the merits of what was brought forward, but ultimately that's what happened with Waxman, or part of what happened with the Waxman-Markey bill, as it is known to history. I think the other point is I was going to make is that I think we're fundamentally living in a different time. I think that people's understanding of what a real meaningful climate agenda has to be now is fundamentally transformed. And I mentioned some of the factors that I thought have transformed it, right? There has been the arrival of the movement for a Green New Deal. There has been, as Rihanna was saying, a better understanding finally in the Democratic circles of the need for industrial policy in this country. I don't think it's taken as deep enough hold yet, but I think we're on the movement there, which is like, no, this is about, we can't just let markets figure these problems out for us. And then, as I mentioned, a long overdue recognition and incorporation of justice deeply into the climate agenda. And then I think crucially, and this is key, the use of standards, which comes out of state and local progress. I mean, standards are the only things to learn from states and locals, but there has been the thing that a lot of the lessons need to be derived from over the course, like there hasn't been any movement in DC in the last 10 years on climate policy, or at least legislative progress. But at the states and the local levels, there has been, right? Especially in the last 2, 3, 4 years, you've seen transformational change, like the CLCPA that Anthony was mentioning take place in New York State, like policies that have been implemented in Washington, in California, even Colorado. There are now 10 states that have passed 100% clean electricity laws. There are a number of others that have taken action through executive orders on economy-wide programs. There are robust investments being brought forward by state green banks. There are all sorts of meaningful solutions that can be derived from that areas. Anyways, that's all to say, I think there is a lesson to be learned, a clear lesson to be learned for policymaking and all the strategy and apparatus that needs to go around it. And I am heartened to say that I think that lesson, or a big lesson, has been learned. Pardon.
Cool. Thanks, Sam. I'll jump in here. I was in middle school, I think, so, but I think from where I'm at now and looking back and hearing all the insights from elders like Sam and studying movement history, I think it's clear that it's like about what Rihanna was saying, like the way that policy is done as well, and that if the movements and like people who are closest to the pain are not feeling energized and galvanized to actually be in support and rally behind policy, it's kind of like dead upon arrival, and it can't be shaped if it's not has the buy-in and trust from the people it's most impacted. And so I think right now we've learned a lot from that, and making sure that we're making the approach of the policy as important as the policy content itself, and trying to break down kind of the inaccessible, like wonky nature, and actually lead with what's most exciting and tangible. So for example, when we laid out the resolution for the Green New Deal, it's very project oriented. It's like laying out what will actually look like for communities to be transformed. And we introduced the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. It's a really clear example of how we can tackle decarbonization and employ people living in public housing and transform public housing to be more resilient and healthier for communities. And so I think that's an example. And then also, I think the Harris AOC Climate Equity Act, like laying out the way that policy, like equity in the approach to policymaking needs to be foundational. And I think what I've heard from Max and Marky is that it was really like inside game and led kind of behind closed doors, a lot of kind of lowest common denominator of listening to corporate interests. And I think we've kind of flipped that on its head and know that we need to, be movement centered and make sure that, corporate interest, fossil fuel money is not corrupting the policy, because that's impeding trust from the get-go. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lauren. I'll quickly add, when the Green New Deal resolution dropped, Climate Justice Alliance, we wrote a press statement and with an admonishment, and when we talked about the American Clean Energy and Security Act, AKA Waxman Markey, we stated directly that, the bill included problematic aspects, including cap and trade, and was done with very little frontline and community consultation. And that did lead to disengagement from the part of the working class folk and frontline communities, losses of hundreds of millions of dollars that big philanthropy dumped into it. And it still never had enough momentum to pass the Senate, and actually was a big reason why the president at the time started losing chambers of Congress. So I do think that we have grown immensely from that. And that's, those of you who know me know I like to offer as many polemics in a minute as I can about the climate community. But, I would agree with Lauren that there's just an understanding now that it's not going to be legitimate without the people who are being impacted first and worst by myriad crises, right, that are interlocking now. I was joking around and say the 4 C's, not to be confused with the C4s of COVID, cops, climate, and capitalism, that are really affecting frontline Black, brown, and indigenous people. And there's simply not going to be power behind the forward-thinking things that I'm working with Lauren on, that I'm working with you on, Julian and Rihanna and Sam, without without that grassroots, local, translocal, power behind it. And I think that we are learning that, as Sam was saying, there are so many great examples that we have to scale out and scale up. Many of these are led by the front lines and our incredible youth movement, as well, who have, I think, in my lifetime, for the first time, have just said, we're not waiting for you to give us the torch. This is our crisis as well. And I think that this youth movement, which Lauren, of course, is a part of, would never accept on principle, just because of all the study and the diligence that they put into it. And this is really important for, young people and all people who want to get into so-called activism, is that discipline of studying the past so that we don't make the same mistakes. I think Sunrise has done this job adroitly. I don't see these young people even being cool with any kind of policy that doesn't have the input and the organizing behind it that we need from the grassroots.
Yeah, there was a famous, Sam, did you want to jump in there?
I just wanted to say one more quick thing, Julian, about lessons, because I think it's actually germane, and maybe among the most important lessons is not wait for purported bipartisanship to take hold. We understand that the Republican Party does not have any interest in climate solutions, and we shouldn't wait for them to. They are, funded by the oil and gas industry, and that has pained and weighed down and prevented climate efforts in the past. The second is around prioritization. We can't. Part of the reason that things got in the way in 2009, 2010 is also around there was so much to do, and therefore climate did not get a chance to have its time in the sun legislatively in a successful way, leaving aside the policy merits. I would say also that I'm heartened to hear too, given that Vice President Biden has made these commitments so central to his economic recovery agenda, which is going to mean it's going to be a thing that is going to have to be redressed in the first part of the new year. So again, a note of encouragement. Sorry to jump in with more.
Yeah, I just also want to amplify a comment that was left in the chat, basically stating that regionally it might not be as let's say progressive a story as we've seen sort of the national conversation move, as Kathy comments. That centering frontline communities and sort of skepticism towards carbon markets have not changed dramatically, particularly in places where utilities are influential, like in the South, which is where I assume Kathy's coming from here, given her comment. So I think that's an important point to make, that there is still regional variation and there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made in states across the country. And while I think there's been fairly some movement nationally, there's certainly lots of room for improvement across the board. So I think one point that was brought up here that I just want to amplify as well is that there is a famous sort of post-mortem of Waxman Markey written by Theda Skocpol, who's a political scientist at Harvard University. And one of the key takeaways that she had was that there was not, during Waxman Markey, the sort of robust civil society movement engagement with the legislative fight. And I think that one of the more heartening things of this moment is that that has certainly changed. And when Skocpol wrote that we did not have a robust social movement at the time, I assume that she meant we did not have, when I read that, I assumed that she meant we did not have a Lauren Maunus on Capitol Hill. Sorry, I had to get that one in. So just moving on to the next question, or the next sort of topic, I guess. You know, progressives are known for pushing the party, right? That is almost kind of our role. We're here to push the party to do better, to represent its values, its principles, its grassroots activists more effectively. So I'd like to actually go around next and see if, and anyone can really start on this one, where the most effective place might be for progressives to apply pressure with the limited time we have left leading up to the election, and then in the limited time left we have, knock on wood, to the next Congress and administration. And anyone can start on that one.
I'll jump in. I would say appointments, right? People love to say personnel is policy. And in a lot of ways it's true. And so I think that thinking a little bit about like where are the places that will be interacting the most with the climate agenda, I think about it particularly like the Green New Deal. And so a place that I think about appointments a lot is the Fed and OMB. Because the Federal Reserve can play a huge role in changing the rules around financing fossil fuel infrastructure and how banks have to think about the ways that they invest. And also OMB is just like such a hub for so much that happens in federal government. And it seems from talking to folks in the Obama administration that having folks in OMB who are both progressive and interested in climate could have really helped a lot back during ARA, during the last crisis.
We can go around according to the layout of my screen. So let's go this way next, and next is Lauren.
Cool. Anthony mentioned this a few times, alluded to it, but I think in the next few months, we have to make sure that we get really clear commitments from members of Congress, that they're not just in theory in support of a green stimulus or standards and investment and justice, but absolutely committed to, pushing all the way and pushing, making sure that in January that is utmost priority for both chambers and for the administration. And so Sunrise is really committed to making sure that we have members' backs when they are championing the most aggressive and ambitious policy, and also committed to making sure that they know the strength of our movement, and that we're watching them, and that this window of opportunity cannot be passed by, and that this is really about survival, and that we're have our eyes on them, and so making that distinction really clear, I think in terms of specific policies that we're really excited about, like making sure get over the finish line. We referenced kind of the 40% of investments to frontline communities. It's really incredible that because of organizing and this demand being uplifted by frontline communities and getting taken up in state policy, that it was included in Biden's plan. But that doesn't mean that it will necessarily be prioritized in the first 100 days. And so I think that's an example of something that Sunrise really wants to put our force behind, to make sure it's foundational to a recovery and the investments there. And same with, I think, public employment programs, especially for young people right now. This is a moment that, Biden presented the civilian climate corps, and different variations of CCC, and there's some really good examples right now that Senator Booker and Representative Holland have led on, I think right now it's going to take a lot of force to actually get some programs like that over the finish line, but there's already a lot of momentum, and I think that's kind of the perfect model that we need to address a lot of the crises we're facing right now. So leave it there.
Come around this way to Anthony next.
Yeah, I'll just quickly piggyback on what Sister Rihanna said. I mean, I think that we need to make sure, with like the great powerful organizing of Sunrise, frontline communities in tandem, to make sure that the appointments have some sort of climate intelligence in every department: Treasury, Defense, Department of Justice, Interior, agriculture. And while I'm on the subject of agriculture, this is really, really important, because we talk about the fossil fuel industry a lot, as we should, but big ag also utilizes fossil fuels, erect massive pollutive infrastructure, including CAFOs, and they must themselves be considered fossil fuel infrastructure, because they treat the land and the workers the same way that the fossil fuel industry does. So we definitely need to have someone in agriculture that understands that rather than being a threat multiplier, agriculture can also actually be a solutions multiplier through regenerative agriculture and agroecological practices. The other thing that I would just say quickly of why appointments matter is because, like, all of these the great policies that all of these panelists have been working on, talking about grants and investments. We talked about learning from the mistakes of Waxman Markey. We also have to talk about a lot of the mistakes that or intentionals that occurred during the original New Deal, which when money was started being allocated, a lot of people were intentionally left out. So this is like where we have to make sure that we have a good federal, state, local partnership to make sure that those dollars are getting to the communities. Like Lauren mentioned, the 40% that comes out of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act from New York Renews. So it is incredible to see Vice President Biden including that in his plan. But we have to have a mechanism in place and people in place who are going to ensure that these investments get to the people who need it the most and who are accountable, to their communities, and ensure that it's not just like people they're bringing in the parachute in to communities and determine how dollars are going to be spent. So I think Rihanna's spot on. Definitely these appointments, and then also to what our friend Kathy said when she wrote to us. Yes, I would agree with you, but also starting to get progressive power into the local elections. The South does definitely have its issues, but one thing that the South has that a lot of northern states and even western states don't have is that their public service commissioners are elected, and that is massive power that can be grabbed if we get good climate people in there who understand that we have to get off dirty fossil fuels.
Sam, I'll pass it to you next, sort of going around my screen in a horseshoe. Yeah,
great, thank you. I want to agree two different things. One, personnel is policy, to pick up on what Rihanna was saying, but I agree with everything that everyone's been saying here, but a key point is the decisions are going to be made about who staffs a transition that builds an administration, of course, God willing, that the Biden-Harris campaign is successful, and then who staffs the administration that takes charge of working with Congress to pass legislation and implementing policies from day-to-day programs to new regulations and executive orders and the like. And the other one is, and this part was already hit on too, is legislation. I mean, I think Congress, the Article 1 player in the Constitution is its own beast, and the new Biden platform that was released last month I think is exceptional and brings forward some really, really important commitments around centering a clean energy-led economic recovery, around environmental justice and economic justice, and in building our clean energy future to confront this climate crisis. I think, though, that much more work needs to be done unpacking these issues in legislative form with members of Congress. And I know folks are engaged in that. And I would just encourage that the progressive community continue to do that, because there's a lot of work to be done in fleshing those policies out and in building coalitions behind them such that we're ready to kick the ball in the goal next year.
So just to recap, we had personnel as policy, we had putting pressure on the administration and members of Congress. We had working with members of Congress where possible to shape policy. And we had, I think, everyone seconded the personnel point about appointments. So I think I would agree with that. All those are really important. I'd add just like two more, just from my perspective. The first is we have a number of, we don't have just a president who's running, a nominee who's running on, partially on climate. We also have some down ballot candidates, particularly for Senate. And I think that in places where Democrats have a pickup opportunity, I think that we want to encourage a number of those candidates to run on the progressive climate policies that the vice president and others have adopted, and show that you can run on these policies and win, and that you can win the Senate running on a pretty bold climate agenda. I think that that's really, really important. And we, being Data for Progress, we released polling on that in Arizona, Iowa, North Carolina, and Maine. Obviously some Senate pickup opportunities there. And then secondly, I think that the persuasion element of all this is going to become really important. How do we persuade, folks who are blue senators in red states or frontline Democrats in battleground districts that they can come out and vote for something like a Green New Deal or a Green New Deal-esque, and feel confident that they can go back to their voters in 2022 having passed something that's good and popular and is providing jobs and doing good things in the economy and society and all that sort of stuff. I think that that's really important. That sort of persuasion element of politics is important to keep in frame. We are almost out of time. I think we have 5 minutes, and then we're gonna be wrapping up. So I actually want to go to Adrian's question in the chat. Adrian is asking, how does the strategy to build a consensus policy agenda contend with fossil fuel companies and monopoly utilities' stranglehold on our political infrastructure? Are we prepared for the fight and resistance from fossil fuels when the policy becomes real? That's a big, meaty question. Does anyone want to take a first stab at that one?
I'm muted. I can take a first stab at it. Are we prepared? No. That's a pretty easy one to answer. And the strategy to build a consensus, I would actually say we haven't done a very good job of that. Honestly, we have focused really closely on demand side and largely sort of left supply side. I would say, like, out of a lot of conversations, even though it's going on, obviously there's continuous fights against pipelines, there's continual organizing against fossil fuel industries. So I think a key to a consensus policy agenda is first, like, a little bit of reckoning, which is a reckoning that we are honestly trying to marry, not factions, but groups that have different agendas and needs, and that part of an issue that the fossil fuel industry has been very smart about is sort of putting it in a place where it's a wedge, where continued operation of fossil fuel industries is going to inherently hurt communities of color disproportionately, because that's where they're placed, that's where the pollution is. But at the same time, it will take away jobs from areas, and particularly, I think, areas or constituencies that might be diverse but are identified as white in sort of a mainstream conversation. And so we end up in a very difficult place where we're saying we're both invested in justice and equity, right? And thus can't have fossil fuels going on for any longer. At the same time, we're like, it's not necessarily popular electorally. And it's certainly as seen as like hurting constituencies and groups that we think of as white. And so I think that's a tension that we are still trying to figure out how to navigate, and that we haven't done particularly well.
I'm going to hop in really quickly as well and try to also answer another question, including, and what's up, Adrian? Good, I appreciate the question. The strategy of building a consensus policy agenda, I mean, I think that it's really popular education and putting it into like layperson's terms, right? I was on a great call, or a great panel with our good sister Tamara Tolles from 350, of just saying, like, 1.5 degrees sea level rise, that's real for us because, like, we're wonks, but to the people that we have to mobilize, we have to put this into the context of extraction, and also the entire United States economy on the brink of this boom and bust industry. I mean, I was playing a joke, as many of you know, right before the summer, there was a point in time where oil and gas stocks were less than a bottle of beer. They were less than a clove of garlic, and really articulating that to people in a way that they understand that puts them and their communities that are dependent on these, crude cash payouts, like that their communities are at risk. And I think that once people understand that, like they will definitely get mobilized. There's a quick question from Mackenzie Feldman about leveraging the issues of agriculture to get farmers who've been screwed by Trump's policies to vote blue. What I would say to you, Mackenzie, is that, I've been hiding out here in Nebraska during the COVID outbreak, missing my hometown of Seattle, of course, but they're mad as hell, Mackenzie. And I think that it's about engagement, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, but we have to go back to what Howard Dean did, and he put infrastructure in place for Barack Obama to become president. It was a 50-state strategy, none of this flyover state stuff. There are progressives all over the place in the South, in Appalachia, in areas of the Pacific. Well, the Pacific Northwest is super progressive, but and not take these people for granted, because they are hurting. They are mad as hell right now. They know that they've been screwed by this administration and the big ag industry as a whole. And if we don't give them a home to come to, they're either going to get seduced with a bunch of lies and not the truth, or just become torpid and not vote at all. So that's on us. That's on the organizers. I know, like, Sunrise has been in the Midwest, in Iowa, in Nebraska, in Minneapolis, Wisconsin, and not like, I'm not trying to sound like Obama of like red states and blue states. Like, just focus on people. Everyone's been screwed right now, and this is exactly why authors like James Baldwin and authors like Assata Shakur and Angela Davis have been trying to, like, get the point across that white supremacy screws white people too, and that's a truth that we're going to need our white comrades to swallow as we go into these areas and pick these people up.
Just moving to another question that came into the Q&A. I will fully acknowledge, by the way, that I'm a Luddite, so I think I get this Q&A thing. I'm not sure anyone else is getting them. So I have one question in the Q&A that I'm going to turn to. I don't know if anyone else can read it. But the question is from Martin Silva, and it says, Sam Ricketts mentioned earlier not to wait for bipartisanship to move on this being climate legislation, Green New Deal type stuff. But what can we do as progressives to get legislation passed in Republican-controlled legislatures, or even a possible Republican-controlled Senate in 2021? I think this is a really important question that we're all going to have to grapple with if things do not go according to plan in November, or if folks happen to live in red states that need to do climate action as well, what do we do? What do we do in the divided government scenario? I don't want to take a stab at that because it's not my favorite question.
Maybe I'll sign up because the question builds on something I said earlier. Look, I think that this is a really important point. There isn't Republican support for climate action at its scale. You might find a mayor here and there. You might find a state legislator here and there who's willing to work on some solutions. But the party is diametrically opposed to large scale action, and it's an important reckoning point in order to make progress. I think fundamentally. And this goes to the point Kathy was making. I think progress is going to be stymied in places, in states with Republican-controlled legislatures. Again, not everywhere. You're seeing some progress occur. You've been seeing some meaningful progress that occurred in places like South Carolina in the last year. But that's by and large going to be the case. And so, Kathy, I think your point earlier was to what about this is the need for large-scale federal action, which I think all of us would agree with. Hence the conversation. But the point even more pointedly about is this leads me to a good point about the future of the United States Senate. The United States Senate, in order to make the kind of change happen that we're all talking about here, you're going to need legislation, and that means you're going to need the United States Senate. So that means, to Anthony, Julian, to your question earlier about pressure points, we got to flip the Senate. We got to win at least likely 4 seats, and there's an opportunity to do that. So get involved in North Carolina, get involved in Maine. Get involved in Kansas, get involved wherever you can, Arizona, Colorado, Montana, et cetera, because we've got to flip the Senate. And yet, if we don't, and well, with or without doing so, the Biden administration, it's going to be incumbent on them to also move forward aggressively with existing authorities under executive action. That's going to be true on day one, no matter what Congress looks like. But especially if the Senate remains Republican, that's going to be important. And then to the question of how do you leverage votes in the Senate? I mean, I think you're going to see the same thing you saw in 2009, which is Mitch McConnell, if he's still a majority leader in 2021, doesn't matter how bad unemployment is, doesn't matter how bad a pandemic would be, he would say anything that helps solve these problems means it helps the president, means I'm going to oppose it, which is evil and sadistic, but those are 2 words that describe Mitch McConnell. So again, the importance of flipping the Senate. I think the other thing is, like, if that is the situation, how do you leverage votes? And I think that, again, the more popular frame and the more necessary frame now, one way or the other, is going to be about economic rebuilding rather than just stopping pollution. And that's the world we live in now, fortunately.
Yeah, I'll totally go, but I wanted to make space for Rihanna or Lauren in case, But Lauren, yeah.
I think this is a long fight too. So not just thinking about like this election or 2 years from now, but really thinking about Sunrise, got off the ground like when the Senate was controlled in Republican control, and we've been able to really shift the agenda in the past few years in this current environment. Not saying that we've been able to pass great climate policy in the past few years, but we've energized millions of young people who are going to continue to be involved. And if there's more Republican control, they're only going to be angrier and more militant. And I think, it takes, years to set up candidates to run populist campaigns and actually win these seats. And so this is really just the start of doing that. So obviously we're working as hard as we can to make sure we can win governing power. That is definitely the goal, sustain governing power, and also the long fight and movements. We'll continue to get behind good candidates for the long haul.
Yeah, the only thing I'll quickly add, because I know time is running out, is that if we don't flip the Senate, then we at least for frontline and grassroots and even our friends from the Big Greens, we're going to have to think about like what a local strategy looks like. There are municipal elections coming up, even DAs. You got a progressive DA like Larry Krasner, who is like committed to holding polluters accountable. All of that matters, and all of that is what Lauren was saying, builds the momentum for that longer fight. The Republicans had a long fight in hands when Obama came to office office in 2008, started gobbling up local seats, local state houses and whatnot, and were able to wreak havoc. Draconian transphobic bathroom bills, attacking women's reproductive justice, and of course, even being able to sue local communities that ban fracking, like our sisters and brothers in Denton, Texas. So just don't lose sight of that. People like that, it's super, super important. I'm proud to come from a city where we passed a Green New Deal resolution in Seattle, but we still have to put the heat on and help people like Shama Sawant out and making that into a resolution, so into an ordinance, excuse me. So yeah, we're like Sam said, we got to fight. There's so many Senate pickups, possible here in even next door in Iowa. Joni Ernst is in trouble. Arizona was mentioned. Maine was mentioned. Georgia is in the map. South Carolina, y'all go give Jamie Harrison some money right now. He's 2 points down. Like, we invest in that and knock out Lindsey Graham. Like, that's huge. So, but also just don't lose sight of the local, because like there's a lot of power there.
Well, with that, I just want to thank our brilliant panelists. We had, again, Rihanna Gunn Wright, Anthony Rogers Wright, Lauren Maunis, and Sam Ricketts. It was a real pleasure and honor to get to moderate this panel. My name is Julian Brave Noisecat, and I guess you can find all of us except for Anthony on Twitter, so maybe that's where the conversation will continue. And I also just want to thank Sam and Evergreen Action for initiating this panel, in particular Sam's colleague Jamal Rod, who organized us all together, bugged us on the emails, did all the things to make this happen. Really excited for everything that lies ahead with climate, progressives, November and 2021. Feeling kind of hopeful, actually, and many of the folks who were both in the chat and on this panel are a big part of that. So thank you guys all, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Happy Friday, y'all.